astrology has the properties of science, but in itself, it's not a science. But just because it's not a science doesn't mean it's not something that we shouldn't listen to or pay attention to. I feel like it's kind of like art in a way, where we don't look to art for, to teach us factual information and precise information about something. We go to art to feel, to awaken something within us, to maybe even get mad, because oftentimes we don't allow ourselves to get mad about the things that are happening or have happened in our life. And we look for art to feel those emotions that we have been suppressing, to trigger something within us, to wake up back to life, to not walk for life asleep. And we look for some sort of catalyst for change, because we're so stuck where we are, and deep down we know that the change will happen when we make it happen, when we put the effort and the work into it. But because change is hard, so we look for some sort of confirmation that it will all be worth it in the end. And we look for it outside of ourselves often. And in that way, astrology is not a science. It's a language that you have to learn to understand. I don't believe its main function is foretelling or fortune telling, whatever you want to call it. If it's ever its function, I feel as some foretelling is a direct consequence of learning the language of astrology, not something you necessarily need to strive towards. When you attempt to foretell consciously, I think you're playing with the old-time question of whether you have a real ability to tell the future, or, as science has proven many, many times, placebo effect. If you imagine something for long enough, or if you believe something to be true, your mind sets it as a goal to aim for, unconsciously. And often you do make decisions that lead you to that goal. When you understand the language of astrology, you understand the language that the universe is speaking to you in the moment now, in the present. And that's how I primarily like to use astrology. You can use astrology to translate the universe, what the universe is saying to you, and that way the universe speaks to you through synchronicity. So if you can imagine, for instance, that in your dream last night you saw a bird, a specific kind of bird, let it be a hummingbird or an eagle, or, in New Zealand we have our own birds that are not really native to anywhere else, like the fantail. And then shortly after waking up, maybe you're driving to work, or maybe you're drinking your morning coffee and you look outside the window and you see that bird. That is a synchronicity. That is the universe speaking to you and reminding you about your dream. And maybe the dream is not about the bird per se, but it's a reminder that whatever you've seen, whatever you felt in that dream is really important. And that is the language I'm referring to here, the language that the universe speaks to. It's archetypal, it's mythological, and it's symbolic. I also do think it's really fun and worthwhile to understand the past from an astrological lens, but again, when you do, you have to be cautious and you have to be aware that when you're studying these patterns and these cycles, like I've said before, and I'd like to repeat that, the consequence of that is that you will not be able to necessarily foretell events, because like I said, fortune telling, it's not its main function, but you will understand cycles and the way it works, because like I said, we're not here to tell the future. It's very, very different. But regardless of that, I feel like it was really important to start this podcast with the introduction of what my definition of astrology is and where I'm coming from. However, I do feel like it's important and incredibly fascinating to have looked at these studies that were done over the past decades to attempt to disprove astrology. What the intention was behind these studies, we might never know. What the intention is behind people trying to disprove astrology is, I suppose, it is fear. And perhaps it's the fear of the fact that your destiny is set in stone. Personality is set in stone. But as we're going to unravel these studies and look at it in this podcast slowly, bit by bit, you'll also understand that your destiny, your fate, your personality is not set in stone, and it was never meant to be. Or suppose, let me rephrase that. Astrology has never claimed it to be. We do have evolutionary astrology as a branch of this language that we're discussing today. And the whole point of evolutionary astrology is that not only do you evolve as a human being on this planet, is your identity evolved, you're evolving as a soul as you go through lives. And that opens up another debate about past lives and current lives and all that, which I don't really want to get into. I have my own personal opinion about it. It's my own worldview. I think it's unique, but let's dive in. So the initial investigation that I did into the scientific research on astrology was to look into the research that indicates that people who believe in astrology have lower intelligence, and there turns out to be a lot of papers on that, which I honestly, initially I saw that as an Instagram something. It was either a still image or an article that someone was promoting, or a reel. I can't remember for the life of me. But the stuff on intelligence does trigger me personally, and as you know, this is a very raw and honest podcast, so I do have a bit of a tick with that, which is not super healthy. I'm working on it, and over the years I have worked on it a little bit better. Like, I have my own history of why that is, and I think everyone has that a little bit, and I think everyone needs to look into that, those certain words that can be more triggering to you than to anybody else. So for me, digs on my intelligence are not very appreciated, although of course I have learned how to react to them better, which I don't know if doing a whole research on all the studies that claim that people who believe in astrology are lower intelligence is a healthy approach, and then recording a podcast about it and then telling you guys about it. But at least, I'm sharing and I'm telling you that if you believe in astrology, which you probably do if you're watching this video, or at least you're a little bit curious, it's not really what these studies mean. It's so what they actually looked at in the studies. So one of such papers here I have written down, which, by the way, these are my notes if you see me reading, if you're watching, is by Bauer and Durand. I think it's Durand. In 1997, profile astrology believers as less educated and less in control of their affairs. Which is kind of interesting. First of all, I don't know what you mean by less in control of their affairs. Does it mean that somebody's less interested in taking responsibility for their life, maybe? Like, that could be potentially what they try to say. Because sometimes people, even adults, in their own lives, are less in control of their affairs, even though they want to be a little bit more responsible. But because of where they come from, their situation in life, they have been put into an environment, like, for example, they might be in an abusive relationship, they might be in an abusive job, or they might be stuck in their abusive job because they have a lot of bills to pay and a lot of children to pay for, and they don't have a partner. Like, what do you mean by less in control of their affairs? I guess in the 90s, maybe it meant something else than it does now. The economic climate is very different as well from 90s to now too. So not quite sure, but less educated. It's pretty self-explanatory. It's probably somebody who maybe went to high school, didn't go to college, or maybe didn't finish high school and went into workforce immediately. Again, this has been done in the 90s. You don't have to go to college now to be as educated as a college level degree person. I'm not talking about PhD. I'm not talking about having a master's degree. That's a little different. But with the amount of information that we have, the amount of books you have available to you that you can just simply order online, you can, if you wanted to put the effort to, be as educated as someone on a college level education. So again, very different definitions, very different environment and climate. Moving on. There was another study done by Lindgren in 2014, challenged the assumption that astrology belief is a hallmark of political conservatism. Very interesting. It's interesting to me because it seems as though nowadays, at least, there are more liberal astrologers than they are conservative astrologers. If we're talking politically, right? So instead, what that showed, which is probably what I'm saying, is that demographics are of the younger age and lower education. Again, lower education were more strongly associated with seeing astrology as credible. Like, you have to be aware of these words I'm using, because I'm going to get to this most important part. What did they actually look for in these studies, and what did they find? So most of these studies looked at the question of, do you believe astrology is scientific? And most of these studies, like, here's the stitch incoming, here's a stitch. Have you noticed how all of these studies use like the exact same wording? People who believe in astrology is scientific are usually younger in years, less educated, and less in control of their affairs. Okay, cool. So the studies specifically focus on people who uncritically accept all astrological claims, usually show lower scores on intelligence tests, educational levels, or critical thinking skills than those people around you. First of all, if you uncritically believe in something in general, and you hold on to the belief, it does show less education because you have less critical thinking skills. So critical thinking, I think one main part of it involves being able to have an opinion about something, but being open to be wrong about it, and allowing the information that's coming into you, whether it be from other people or from a class or from a YouTube video or from a book, to change your opinion on that. And what else did I say in my notes? So here's what the research doesn't show. It does not mean that everyone who finds astrology meaningful or helpful is unintelligent. And the reason why is that they specifically asked people who believed, and this is not you, by the way, and this is very, very low percentile of humanity, who believed the influences that the planets have on us to be unquestionable and very, what's that word? Not direct, but very blatant, so to speak. So when people like Neil deGrasse Tyson and other such critics of astrology or astrologers try to disprove astrology, they use specifically that language to say, what is it that they say? That People who believe that planets tell you what to do are stupid, right? This is the blatant language, which is really rude, first of all. Second of all, people who believe in astrology don't believe that planets tell us what to do. We believe in metaphorical. We believe in the symbolic language of it. It's kind of looking into mythology to understand the human cycles, the human mind, our imagination, our human experience, or doing dream work as well to understand our human experience. And this is the wonderful way that we can use astrology to understand who we are and what is going on around us, like I said, in the present moment, in the moment now, not in the future. So no, we don't think planets are telling us what to do. And also, I don't know if most astrologers believe that planets are conscious or are actually affecting us. I think that's also a big misconception. I think most of us believe, or at least entertain the idea, let's say, because a lot of the work in astrology is entertaining ideas and imagination in order to understand the human condition. A lot of us, I think, see that there's a correlation between what happens within us internally and what is happening externally with the planets, but it doesn't mean the planets are doing it consciously. It just means that there are cycles and there are seasons to things, seasons to the way that we feel, seasons to the way that we think. That's all I'm going to say on those studies, which are very, very interesting. Now let's move on. Before I completely wrap up these ideas that I've been describing. So what this research on intelligence specifically does not show or does not study is, for one, like I've already mentioned, doesn't mean that everyone finds astrology meaningful or helpful as an intelligent. Number one. Two, it doesn't say anything about people who enjoy astrology for introspection, storytelling, or psychological insight, like many of us do. And many intelligent, educated people are curious about astrology or use it symbolically as a way to understand themselves, their emotions, or their relationships that uses more psychological and metaphorical. Again, not scientific, because we have to understand the difference between something that's really scientific and always is a fact and never is, and never wanes, like 2 + 2 is 4, right? But then again, we have quantum physics. So it's a deeper debate that I don't want to get into right now, and that's all I'm going to say about it. Also, those studies did not take into account somebody like Richard Tarnas, who is incredibly intelligent and spent 30 years. He used to be a historian, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, he set out on a quest to disprove astrology as well and got seduced by the subject. So, some history. Very short. Where does it all come from? This hatred towards astrology. I think it's a discomfort, like I already said, with believing that something is already fated and being out of control in your own life, which I get, and it's a pretty normal feeling to feel when someone is telling you that no, this is the future and it's not changeable. But most astrologers don't do that. Most tarot readers don't do that. Most healthy healers out there don't operate on that level. And that had to be taken into account. It is important to look at it from a metaphorical lens, but also I feel like in our day and age, and maybe that's changing already, but there has been a strong emphasis on what I see in front of me is real, and anything that I don't see does not exist. But that doesn't take into account another problem, which is we don't perceive everything that is in our periphery. Like we can't, I think it's something crazy, like 20% we actually perceive. But anyway, that's not in my notes, so don't quote me on that. I could be wrong. But the strange way that we see astrology, it's historic, especially in America. I'm not in America, I don't live there, but I know in America it's a very strange relationship with it, where people seem to be fascinated with it, yet a lot of people have a lot of discomfort around it. So astrology was banned and restricted and blown out legal in some parts throughout history in various places. In ancient Rome, for instance, fear that astrological predictions could undermine the emperor by predicting his death or promoting rivals, which is another important thing historically to note that a lot of people miss when they try to disclaim or disprove astrology, is that historically it wasn't used for personal use. Like, I'm pretty sure personal use of astrology star until like the late 19th century was always meant for the emperor, was always meant for the king, was always meant for the city itself or the empire itself. It was never meant for an individual, especially not us, the plebs. We're never meant to use it, but now we do. Sorry guys for putting you in on my pleb thing. I called myself a pleb, I didn't call you a pleb, just so you know. Things just got weird. During Middle Ages, the Catholic Church condemned predictive astrology as it was seen as challenging divine providence and God's plan. Which also makes sense. Like, the Catholic Church and Catholicism in general, and religion in general kind of condemned astrology for a long time, even though before Islam astrology was used widely. I don't know the history of the Middle Eastern astrology. You gotta go for all that kind of stuff. You gotta go to Chris Brenna's channel for that, as you probably already know if you are here. In the 20th century, many U.S. cities and countries passed laws restricting or banning fortune telling, which sometimes included astrology. But I highly recommend that you do your own research about the history, because if we start delving into it in detail right now, it's going to make this podcast way too long. If you really want me to do a podcast on the history of astrology, I will do it. I will enjoy the research and I will do it, but you got to let me know, because it's a lot of work and it's a lot of time. And I need to know that someone wants to listen to it before I go head first. So, oh, by the way, you know how to contact me, right? Like, you can send me an email, you can send me an Instagram, or you can, what's another one? You can just comment if you want a specific type of video on these subjects. So, finally, getting into the meat of it, let's look into the research that disputes astrology and find out if that research is valid. So let's look at the study number 1. And this is probably the most infamous or famous study that is used to discredit astrology. When someone says, hey, no, astrology has never been discredited, people are like, no, what about the Shawn Carlson study of 1985? He did a double-blind experiment, and because it's a double-blind experiment, and all of a sudden it's just, more valid? It was a good idea, his experiment, but let's find out what actually happened. So he did 2 parts of it. In one part, he used 193 subjects, and they were giving astrological personality profiles, so their natal chart interpretations, and were asked to pick which one of these was their own, effectively testing whether an individual recognizes themselves in their chart readings better than random chance. In the other part, 28 professional astrologers were each given a person's natal chart, along with 3 personality descriptions from a standardized psychology test, the California Personality Inventory, CPI, which, by the way, before I go on, I have to mention, surprisingly, I do have friends that are qualified therapists, qualified psychologists in the United States, and I've asked around and none of them know what CPI is, which means that it might have been more widely used in the 80s than it is now, because there's other tests now. I think the Big 5 is the most popular tests used to identify personality, but in themselves, these tests have a few interesting problems. They're not perfect, is all I'm going to say. So the astrologer in the study had to select which of the free profiles best matched the person's chart and also rank how well each profile fit. So the second part is probably the most important part of the whole experiment. Let me just rephrase this and describe this to you, like, so you can have a really good imagery of what actually happened. So these 28 professional astrologers, which I'm pretty sure we don't know the names of unless they came out and said they did the study. No. And then they were given 3 different personality descriptions that were summaries of the CPI test. So they weren't actually the results of the CPI test. They weren't actually the graphs that were produced from those testings. There were summaries that Shawn Carlson wrote himself. Just important to note. So both the subjects and the astrologers failed to do better than chance. Subjects could not pick their own chart interpretation reliably, and the astrologers' matches were no more accurate than random. Gasp, gasp, of course. When you say it like that, it sounds as if astrology failed. So here's a few problems with study. So Carlson's method of analysis included a CPI report, like we already mentioned, of the subject personalities in their natal chart, like we've already mentioned. But the problem is in the detail. Carlson did not give the astrologers a raw CPI report, and fair enough. Right? Fair enough. Those reports are not meant to be used they're only meant to be used by professional therapists, but instead he gave them a summarized report of the CPI using his own words. And something you need to know about Carlson before we go on is that the man wasn't a trained psychologist either. He wasn't trained to read the CPI reports. He was a theoretical physicist, which of course sounds like the man must have been a genius. And he probably was. Like, theoretical physics is incredibly difficult. So he should have known how to read a CPI report too, probably. But the issue is that he summarized those reports in his own words. And on paper, the study looks legit. When you observe the details, it's pretty obvious that the astrologers were kind of set up for failure, because we don't actually know how closely related these 3 different summaries were to one another. And by the sound of it and the look of it, of what some astrologers that came out said, that the summaries were incredibly closely related. They sounded really similar to one another, and it was almost like using chance to pick out which one. So it could say, like, what is a good example I found? I'll find an example and I'll read it to you if I have it here, but maybe I didn't write it down. But it wasn't clear. There wasn't a clear difference between the 3 CPI reports. So each one was a condensed narrative, usually a paragraph or 2, derived from the subject's CPI test results, written to highlight their prominent personality traits. These summaries were anonymized, lacking the subject's name, gender, or any identifying info. Each astrologer received 3 similar-looking summaries, 1 correct, and 2 randomly chosen to serve as foils. They were labeled with arbitrary codes like A, B, and C. In other words, the summaries may have been too close in content and tone, limiting how effectively astrologers could use chart cues to distinguish them. Unfortunately, just how closely related these summaries were to one another is hard to tell, as, here's the stitch, even with academia access, you cannot retrieve the actual narrative summaries used in Carlson's study. Trust me, I tried. They're simply not part of the published record. As soon as you put that interpretation into the mix instead of the data in your methodology, I don't think you can call that science, can you? So he's not using the data, he's using his own words to describe the data. Which brings me to problem number 2, the key test materials. The actual personality summaries astrologers had to match were never published or made publicly available. Dun, dun, dun. Mysterious music coming in. Here's what it implies. Lack of transparency. For one, of course there's a lack of transparency. Like, if you can't see and analyze the study and it was just written as a report that came out in a Nature journal, whatever journal it came out in, how are you going to know? How are we supposed to know that what you've written in there is legit? So without access to the actual summaries, no one can independently assess how accurate, detailed, or distinguishable they were. It's impossible to know whether the tests were fair, or whether the summaries were so similar or poorly constructed that failure was inevitable. In science, the science from capital S, methods and raw materials must be reviewable to verify the integrity of a study. Carlson's study fails this test. Let me just sip my mate while you think on that. God, I made this mate so strong and bitter. Argentinian friend now, so hopefully she can teach me how to do this properly. I'm drinking yerba mate if you're not sure what I'm talking about. Not the point. Problem number 3 in Shawn Carlson's study was that he never sorry, let me just read my notes before I dramatically try and reread them to you. That he was never formally educated in psychology nor astrology, so that's just another thing I wanted to point out. That fine, he wasn't educated in astrology, but you know, to do a study, I feel like to do a clean study like that, you need a therapist or a psychologist, someone who's educated in the arts of the mind, and an astrologer as well, to make sure that the way that the methodology of the study is clean. So Carlson was an experimental and theoretical physicist, and he was also never formally trained in how to read CPI. Not that we are aware of. There's no information on it, so I'm guessing no is the answer. In conclusion, to say that Carlson's most famous paper that disproves astrology is far from scientific and has a lot of issues related to it. Problem number 4. It doesn't take into account the main astrological factor, which that the chart is a potential, not an exactitude. So like we talked about in the beginning and introduction of the podcast, the personality changes over time. It shifts. And depending on where the person is in their life, and depending on personal choices and free will and circumstances, your personality does not stay the same. Now, for those of you who are like, oh, okay, so astrology doesn't work because the personality doesn't stay the same. No. You have to understand. When you get a chart, I can't remember who said that. I think it might have been Liz Green. It might not be Liz Green, so I'm sorry if that's not her quote or someone else's, but I do remember someone giving a great analogy for this and saying that when you're born, you get your natal chart, your astrology map. And that map is kind of like the map of the city. And within that city, you can go to different places, you can do different things, and you can make choices. But you can't go outside of the city. You have to stay within those parameters. So you grow and evolve within those parameters, which sounds limiting, but it's actually not, because sometimes having more choices is confusing. And yeah, basically that's the idea of a chart being a potential rather than a definitive way to read a personality that's like set in stone when you're born. Obviously, of course not. As you can understand, when a baby is born, they're growing and they're developing, and they're going to be doing that for the rest of their lives. Most people do, hopefully, and that's the hope that we have, right, for humanity, is that we're all growing and evolving. Let me just take a breath. Maybe you need to take a breath as well. I feel like I forgot to breathe in that rant. Problem number 5. Astrology doesn't use that kind of language. The kind of language that they use in personality tests. Like, rather than define a personality, astrology uses symbolic and metaphorical languages, and languages of myth and stories. We use imagination to understand the potential. And when you think imagination, all of a sudden it becomes... I think people don't give enough credit to imagination and the kind of healing it can provide, especially for yourself when you're a creative person. And as soon as we say imagination, all of a sudden it becomes not true. But I just watched recently the movie Tolkien, and it is an account of his life and the events that happened and what actually inspired him to write The Lord of the Rings. And in The Lord of the Rings, he uses imagination to describe real feelings. Not even so much the events, but real feelings and emotions that he has gone through and his friends have gone through. That's the idea, and that's the healing. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. Problem number 6. Astrology doesn't actually see personalities as set in stone at birth. It's a rare astrologer that would make that statement, and I wouldn't personally go to an astrologer like that for a reading. Instead, most practicing professional astrologers believe that personality is fluid. There's an issue of free will, potential, and choice as well. Actually, that could have probably went with problem 4. I was in a writing mode, clearly. But that's the same as problem number 4. We already discussed it. And the last problem, one that one of my friends who's a therapist has pointed out, is that these personality tests, like the CPI, the California Personality Investigator or something, I can't remember, but the personality test that they used in this study, they're not universally agreed upon, and this one was developed in like mid 20th century America and may just not fit well across all cultures and contexts, especially nowadays. And when you look at the personality test yourself, like what you're doing is personality test is that the subject actually has to answer their own questions. So there's still that issue of trying to not trying to answer honestly, but like how much am I trying to find the right answer? Like what is the answer that's going to give me a result that I am I am determined, I am self-reliant, I am all those things that are considered good in society, because no one wants to lose face, even though these tests are anonymous. You're still doing a test, like you're meeting all the scientists. So basically, the point of that is there's that issue with personality tests where we are trying to make ourselves sound better than we are. And astrology does not give you an opportunity to do that, unfortunately. It shows you from the way that you are, not good or bad, but as things are, and as things evolving, and where are those things evolving into? What are you blossoming into? What are you becoming into? It's the story of becoming. Are you guys still with me? This is going to be a very long podcast. I feel like I'm going to try and make it not too long, but actually, no, who cares? This is really important, and we do have to look into every detail. So, study number 2. We're going to close off on this study and go on to the next one. As the weather outside is insane today in Auckland. It's just a great day to hide at home and read a book. But that's not what we're doing. We're talking about... Did that sound Canadian? Sometimes I say about like a Canadian, because I went to international school and I had lots of Canadian teachers. But anyway, enough about me. Study number 2 that attempted to disprove astrology. It was done by Dean and Kelly in 2003. And the study was called Is Astrology Relevant to Consciousness? And Psi. So Psi meaning psychology or psyche. Or like psychic events, so to speak. So what was the study trying to test? They wanted to find out, 1, does astrology have predictive or explanatory power? 2, can astrologers match charts to real personality traits better than chance? And 3, if astrology does work, could it be due to some psychic effect instead of stars? So I wonder if they specifically worded this study in this way because there's a lot of evidence that have been done, especially by the CIA, that psychic events like remote viewing are totally plausible and real and doable. Just because something is not tangible doesn't mean it's not real, right? So with this specific study, the problem arises when we look at the first issue, is that Kelly and Dean did not actually run an experiment like Carlson, but instead gathered data from previous studies, and some of these studies used personality tests, and others did not. The biggest issue with this study is lack of consistency across the board, making it kind of less clean. And why is that a problem for validity, right? Well, we have incomparable definitions of personality, again, like this whole personality test thing, where are you using a CPI? Are you using the Big Five? Are you using, what's it called, the Eysenck model, of biological temperament or whatever? Like, which one are you using? So one study may define introversion one way, and another may use the CPI, where introversion is measured for social restraint and self-control, while others may use homegrown or custom-made scales like artistic ability or intuition to describe the same trait but in different words, giving it also a slightly different definition, because different people define introversion and intuition is not the same thing, even though a lot of people who are highly intuitive are more introverted. But also, I don't want to get into the intuition thing again in this one. You can listen to my last podcast about it. And I also think that intuition is a muscle and a skill rather than just a God-given gift, which it is a God-given gift, but we all have it. All of us, every single person. So astrologers were, across studies, being asked to match charts to completely different frameworks in this Dean and Kelly study, and often with no access to how those traits were defined. Which poses another problem, right? You can't combine studies that measure different variables and expect a meaningful meta-analysis. And meta-analysis assumes that each study is measuring the same outcome, at least operationally, but Dean and Kelly's combined data violates that assumption. In conclusion, all I have to say about this one is that it lacked consistency, and in this particular study makes it irrelevant to look further into other problems of this study for me, which are many, of course. For instance, once again, we're considering that the personality is set in stone, not fluid, which the reason why I keep mentioning that, because you kind of lose the definition of astrology when you start saying that the personality is as is. I get it. It's a big definition of pop astrology, and it's something that floats on the internet, like Geminis are toxic and Scorpios are brooding, which I don't know. Of course, sometimes that can be true, but just because it's true sometimes doesn't mean that this is how us people who are really interested in and investigative about astrology and understanding of the nuances of it really see the subject. We see it as fluid. We see personalities as fluid. We see ourselves as fluid and as growing. And one of the reasons why people actually get into astrology is because they want to grow and evolve, because they want to change, because they want to be a better person, they want to have a better life. And What else? What else did I want to say on this? So, yeah. If I missed anything on this specific study, please comment below. But I don't think I did. But if you think I did, please do so. Comment below, and we're gonna move on. And let me have a sip of my mate. It's probably why I'm so hyper energetic lately. I try to drink less coffee and more of this mate stuff, which I don't know. It feels like it's better for me because coffee kind of gives me a headache sometimes. But anyway, moving on. Let's move on to study number 3. We're gonna go back in time, all the way to Silverman's 1971 Birthdates and Marriage Compatibility, an empirical test of astrological predictions, the Journal of Psychology. Problem number 1, and the only problem that I'm going to mention about the study, and one that grinds the gears of any professional astrologer. So we're all in this together, you guys. Just breathe for this one, okay? This is really annoying. The study used sun sign astrology to analyze frequencies of sign pair marriages, divorces, with expected frequencies if signs had no influence. Silverman did not use any other astrological placement to identify marriage predictability or the longevity of a relationship. The sun is important in a relationship synastry, in a relationship chart. Of course it's important. But to use it as a sole identifier of relationships is completely insane. There is Carl Jung actually did research on his clients specifically, so it wasn't I'm not going to talk too much about it on this podcast because it wasn't an official experiment-based research study, but he looked into couples that were who had the longest marriages, and most of them had the sun moon synastry in their charts. So one person's sun would be, excuse me, I'm trying to hold back a hiccup. I don't want to pause this because I actually don't know how to pause it without having to save the video and then start again. So you'll just have to wait. Hold on. So the sun of one person would have to match the moon of the other person in synastry, and that is very interesting. But again, this is really limiting because it's like 2 placements, and I don't believe we can prove astrology that way in any shape or form. But apparently that seems to be true. Like people who have a sun in, for instance, Aries, and their partner is the moon in Aries, they would have a longer relationship. And we can actually, I want to do a separate video on this whole thing and this whole Jungian theory on that. So let me know if you want to hear that. Make a note of it or put it in the comments right now while you're watching, because otherwise I'll go into a whole different rant that we don't need to go to. I'm trying to focus on one thing. This is me just repeating a mantra for myself. So there's not much more I want to say about Silverman's study. Like, even a beginner astrologer knows that for one, using sun sign as a relationship predictor it's not technically correct. It's severely limited. Let's just say that. But I don't know where he had the idea that to use the sun sign. I think the fact that it was done in the 70s, I think there were in the 70s, there was a lot of sun sign astrology that was just based on your, so to speak, horoscope astrology. But we've moved on from then on. We've evolved, and we call this now pop astrology, which has its place, has its time, it's fun, but that's not what we do here on this podcast, and it's not what most professionals do, really. So it shows how limited is the knowledge on astrology in general. So even without doing the study, I can safely say that this man, who was probably also incredibly intelligent, super busy with his own life, could have been doing anything else. His study was doomed for failure. Like, he didn't even need to do it. He could have just asked a professional astrologer, if I do that study, will that work out? And be like, no. Because when you put a sun and sun together in synastry, it does not define a romantic relationship as much as it defines like a sort of, how do we work together, maybe in a business partnership or a rivalry, like, right? I don't know what I just said. Maybe scratch that. We'll see. But I'm sorry to say that Silverman has completely wasted his time. And my time. And your time. Moving on. Study number 4. So these individuals called Mayo, White, and Eysenck, actually, we've mentioned him before. He was a psychologist. So in 1978, they did an empirical study of relation between astrological factors and personality. We already kind of know where it's going, right? The Journal of Social Psychology was the one that published it. So what did the study actually test? What they did, so this is really interesting, this study, right? And you're going to find out soon. Stay tuned. So they took odd and even zodiac signs to prove introversion and extroversion. I've personally, like, it's so funny, like, no matter how long you study astrology, you always find something new. I've never heard of this before, that apparently odd numbered signs like Aries, Gemini, Leo, Libra, Sagittarius, and Aquarius are more extroverted, while even numbered signs are Taurus, Cancer, Virgo, and Scorpio, and Capricorn and Pisces are introverted. Which kind of makes sense, like, for those of you that have been studying astrology or looking into astrology for a long time. It does, like, right? Broader, general speaking. We don't just look at one sign, guys, when we look at astrology. The hypothesis was, we already talked about the hypothesis, the theory. Thank you. And then what else they did is they looked at water signs specifically and neuroticism. So neuroticism is not really a negative. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, those that are psychologists, it's part of the big 5. So neurotic people is kind of like what you're seeing right now in front of you. Somebody who's very animated, I think, and I think is a little bit more anxious than someone who is lower in neuroticism. So they believe that Cancer, Scorpios, and Pisces were more emotionally reactive or unstable and higher in neuroticism. What's interesting is that even though the study only looked at odd number signs and even number signs and the water signs, more neurotic, their study proved that statistically significant correlation was between odd number signs to be higher in extroversion and water signs to be slightly higher in neuroticism. I'm sorry, Pisces, to say that. These results align with traditional astrological claims, and the authors included the famed psychologist Eysenck, was cautiously described as supportive astrology. Oh, no, see, no. Yeah, it's fascinating. Like, as soon as they accidentally prove astrology to be right, or I don't know if that's what they set out to do, they were deemed unscientific. Crazy. But what I do have to say about the study and why I included it as well is because it's not clean either. Like, it still looks at only very narrow elements of the chart. And it's interesting that they found it to be true. But I think you really do need to include the whole chart if you're gonna have a more fair study on this. So, what else did I want to say on this? Yeah, that's it. Like, that's it on this specific study. Like, I do think it's interesting that their findings, they didn't disprove astrology, unfortunately, with this one. All right, let's move on, you guys. Study number 5 was done by individuals called Kurtz, Nienhuys? I'm not sure. What is it? Is that a Swedish last name? I'm not sure how to pronounce this. And Sandhu. So in this study, Kurtz, Nienhuys, and Sandhu, I'm so sorry, I don't know how to pronounce this, looked into the 1955 Mars effect study by Gauquelin. And what that study was is that it showed evidence that the position of Mars in the chart might indicate athletic success. The Mars effect study done in 55 specifically looked at Mars on 2 angles, one on the midheaven and the other one on the ascendant. And the people that had Mars on their ascendant and midheaven usually were more successful in professional sports. I think they found out of all of the charts that they looked at, 30% were more successful. So what it means, like, for those of you who are still learning charts, if Mars is on midheaven, it means that Mars was overhead physically, kind of ish, when the person was born, and Mars on the ascendant means that Mars was on the horizon when the person was born. So I think any practicing astrologer will tell you that Mars effect theory in itself is flawed, because it looks at Mars placement in a vacuum again, and like most of these studies do, without considering that you might have a debilitated Mars, for instance, by aspect or sign, meaning that your Mars could be squaring, like the sun, or your Mars could be in a sign where it feels less comfortable to be athletic and active, like Libra. And also, I think it would be important, like if you were to do another Mars effect study, to consider dignities and to consider rulership as well. So for instance, if your ascendant is in Aries but Mars is not there, but it's another strong placement, like conjunct your sun in the 3rd house, like it does still indicate that athletic ability is something that you're maybe interested in. I don't know if you're good, like, again, have to look at the whole chart, but maybe something you're really good at. Or maybe you need to be athletic in order to process certain feelings and emotions in order to continue to strive towards your goal. And I want to point out another biggest misconception in astrology, and this is important, is that when you read a chart, just because you have a strong Mars, does not mean you'll become a famous athlete. But what it means is that being athletic, like I just mentioned, helps you process, recover from emotional hurt, or maybe even inspire some sort of thought. So I know I'm repeating myself, but I've had that thought, and then I had it in my notes again, but it's an important one to repeat. And what I'm trying to say is that it's this idea that, a hummingbird is always a bird. Like, we've already talked about this, but it's just, again, repeating myself to make my point. A hummingbird is always a bird, but not all birds are hummingbirds. It's the same idea when you look at a chart. In other words, a Mars in key sectors of your chart may be athletic, but not everyone with athletic tendencies becomes an athlete. More often, that Mars might manifest as a need to express physically, to fight for others, or to defend boundaries. So let's say you do have a Mars on the ascendant in Libra. You're more likely to be some sort of an advocate for the people. Maybe you go into law school, maybe you become a lawyer, or maybe you do charity work, or maybe you become a mental health advocate, or maybe you become minority advocate. Like, whatever it is, you want to fight for the people, but it doesn't necessarily make you more athletic. Right. So astrology doesn't always predict what you'll do. It describes how your internal energies want to move. And before we move on, I just want to mention something else that I don't think it's necessarily wrong to isolate a variable, but if you're going to do it, say you want to study Mars and its potential influences on someone's athleticism, then you would need to have other things like aspect, or you have to define the variable clearly. Like, you really have to tell us what you're talking about when you're talking about Mars. You have to contextualize it within the symbolic system, and you have to account for its functional modifiers: sign, house, aspect, rulership, dignity. So I suppose I'm still arguing that you can't have it completely in a vacuum. You need to understand what is Mars's relationship with each other planet, which is why doing a study to prove astrology or disprove astrology would take such a long time, because there's so many different variables. For instance, like Mars or Sun. But that's potentially, like, that's not a guarantee. I haven't really been asked to help someone do a study like this yet. But if they were to, I'd need to really think about what would be the best way and the most fair way to do it, and the cleanest way to do it. Study number 6. So we're looking at Blackmore's and Seebold's study, and it was on the effects of horoscopes on women's relationship satisfaction. Okay. So how satisfied did women become with their relationships after doing an astrology reading, basically? Ridiculous. And I'm not kidding. No, this is actually what the study looked into. So what they did is, let me read my notes just so to make sure I'm not lying to you. Yes, so they wanted to see if reading horoscopes could change how happy women felt in their relationships, like with their boyfriends, girlfriends, partner. And think of it like this: like, if your horoscope says something really nice about your love life, does that make you feel better about your relationship? I don't even, like, do we even need to go into the study too much? Like, this is ridiculous. This is an absolute waste of time and energy, and it's silly. Like, it's silly. Of course, if you think, if an astrologer tells you your relationship is awesome, of course you're going to have more. You don't need to do that. I've already done studies on that. You know what they're called? The placebo studies. That's what they're called. And no, that's not the point of astrology, to make you feel bitter about your life. It's to help you make the changes in your life within yourself, or to look into your life from a different perspective, a different lens. Fine. Okay, fine. Even though it's silly, let me just tell you what happened. So what they do, they took 2 random groups. Group A got a positive horoscope reading about love and relationships. Stuff like, your relationship is strong and good things are coming. And Group B, neutral horoscope, boring general stuff with no advice. Both groups answered a quiz about how happy they were in a relationship, how much they believed in astrology, and they went away and came back 6 weeks later and answered the quiz again. So the group that had the positive readings felt a little happier about their relationship, and the group with the neutral horoscope did not change at all. But the change wasn't huge. It was like a slight difference. And the women who already believed in astrology were ones who already had, like, felt the biggest positive change. Again, the placebo effect. They believe in astrology. They had the reading. Someone said their relationship is great. They feel like it's great. So what does that mean? It means that astrology might not change your relationship, but if you believe in astrology, they might make you feel better. Okay, cool. Problem number 1 that we already discussed. It doesn't sound like the study in astrology. It sounds like it's a study on the positive thinking and how it affects your life, and we already have that. If you go to anybody, like a therapist or a psychic or anesthesiologist for all that matters, like, or your mom, and you ask, like, do you think my relationship is good? And if you believe that person holds some kind of authority in life, then you're going to feel better about your relationship. It's looking for confirmation that you're doing the right thing outside of yourself, which you can argue sometimes astrology does, but not in this way. Don't do that. So literally studied the placebo. So it really did, like, it tested how these pop horoscope messages affect you. And that's interesting. So again, the study did not study astrology. It studied pop astrology, which I get. I think that's what triggers scientists the most, is pop astrology. And without the context and the knowledge about professional astrology, that, yeah, it's very misunderstood. So another problem I had with all of this is, like, who said that happiness is good? And I know this sounds really controversial, but hear me out and bear with me. Like, what is this pressure to be constantly happy all the time? We need to do, like, why do we need to pressure each other into this state of constant happiness? That is the definition of insanity. That's not the definition of insanity, but it is insanity to me. And, like, it reminds me of this apocalyptic movie where everything is pink and yellow and bright colors and everyone's forced to be happy. And there's no room for other emotions. We should not allow for our future as a humanity to go into that direction. I feel like that's where society is headed towards right now, unfortunately. And it's going to be a place where we put restrictions on emotions that we deem as negative. And it's important for us to turn it around and to remind each other that the emotions like sadness, depression, anxiety, anger even, they're not negative emotions. They're valid. They have a place. It's just that we need to understand how to feel them, for one, how to accept them, for two, and then how to use them as fuel. Anger is an amazing fuel for creativity and production of any sort. Like, some of the most successful people that you can talk to or you can listen on other podcasts, they do speak about a lot of anger sometimes that they felt towards someone who would say, like, no, you can't do this. And they use that anger and fuel and energy to build something of themselves. It's really important. So we don't necessarily want to be happy as people. We're sold the idea that we're looking for happiness. We're not looking for happiness. That's a marketing lie. I'm telling you it is. I promise you it is. I know you don't believe me, but trust me. And what people actually want is, we want fulfillment. We want meaning. We want purpose in our lives. We want to be helpful to other people as well. Like, those are seeds of happiness. Those are seeds from which happiness stems from: purpose, meaning, fulfillment. But happiness in itself should not be a destination. And astrology does not claim to make you happier. Show me where it does. Prove me wrong. In fact, nothing can make you happier but you. You can make yourself happier. No partner, no job, nothing. It's how you look at life. It's your perspective on the outer events that happen and how you move through it. But anyway, thank you for coming again to my TED Talk. So the takeaway from this is, the study doesn't disprove astrology again, like pop astrology maybe. It just shows that belief in astrology can influence perception. Believe in anything can influence perception. Like, it's already known. And it talks more about belief and expectation. Shall we move on now? Moving on to study number 7. Wyman and Vyse? Not sure how to pronounce his name. I apologize. But it's a study from 2008, and the study called The Signs versus the Stars, a double-blind test of astrology. We already looked at another double-blind test, which was the Shawn Carlson one, and it was published in the Skeptical Inquirer. Sounds like a really interesting magazine, I just have to say, or a journal, sorry. So what they wanted to test is, could people pick their own astrological profiles over a made-up one, and how could that compare with the real personality report from a well-respected psychological test? It's very, very similar to the Shawn Carlson test. So it looks like they just use that same methodology or similar methodology, but there were a slight difference. So they took 52 college students to do this test, and they were both ages of 19, both men and women. I'm pretty sure equally, or as equally as they could get. Each got 2 reports, one based on their actual Neo 5 factors, so the big 5 test that we've mentioned, which is more used today than the CPI test from the last century, and another based on their birth chart made by a computer. So, problem number 1, like the already obvious one, if you've been listening so far, you'd probably know what I'm going to say, is that, you know, these tests that are done by people themselves. So the participants' study took a psychological personality test to generate their Big 5 profile. So the Big 5 personality profile was not estimated or inferred. Obviously, that's how you take these tests. And it was built from the participants' actual answers. So not only when you take these tests, you kind of anticipate what your answer is going to be. You don't always know. But the anticipation of it and the knowing, so they were closely related. The participants took a personality test and then later were asked to choose which personality report was theirs from their test. So they already had some kind of idea of the kind of traits that the test was asking about. Am I introverted? Am I spontaneous? All of that. So when the reading to reports, they tried to recognize the one that sounded familiar. And astrology profiles were created independently from these people. They were not having an astrology reading. So if they had a reading, for instance, with another astrologer, and I understand like 52 is a lot, but still, if you want to make the study clean, you have to go through the nuances of that. If they had a reading, but they did not know the outcome of the reading, but at least they had a reading, they would kind of like, it would be easier for them to identify which report was theirs. But they didn't do that, and that's a big flaw in this specific testing, because they were just handed like a written interpretation written by a computer, which nowadays I suppose is super easy because you can just have AI write your report, right? And the second big problem is when you're 19, so all these participants were 19, you're still changing and forming, and we've talked about this throughout this whole episode, but 19 especially, I think it is considered that your personality has pretty much been formed by the time you're 21, but these tests, like the other ones we've already looked at, assumes that astrological natal chart is a description of who you are as a person, and that is set in stone when you're born, and it just never changes. Unlike the mass misconception, astrology does take into account change that can be observed for one's transit, personal progressions, etc., etc. You get my drift. Need to say more about this one? No, let's move on. Study number 8. And this is an interesting one done by Helgertz and Scott. Helgertz sounds German. Hold on. I'm not sure if I need to take a moment to like drink my drink or to breathe. Just chill. So the study in 2020 by Helgertz and Scott was named The Validity of Astrological Predictions on Marriage and Divorce. So what did they use? I just want to mention this one really quick because it just shows another study that is not based on actual astrological knowledge. Okay, so there's a lot of people trying to disprove astrology without having any context as to what it is. Like, if you're going to disprove something, you have to at least hold a definition in your hand and have a professional agree upon that definition. Just despicable. Just kidding. I'm just being dramatic. But again, the sun sign here is used in isolation to predict marriages and marriage success. And as we've already spoken about this from another study, as we know, the sun sign is not what you often look at when you consider relationships. Sometimes you do when you're looking at a synastry, but never in isolation from other placements. And what did the study show? That mass market pop culture charts are not reliable predictors of a real world outcome like divorce, which we know it's not news and really didn't need a study for that. I'm sorry, Scott and Helgertz. I don't know why you did that in 2020, or was it just published in 2020, but could have used your time better. Study number 9. And that's the last study we guys are going to look at. And then I really do want to know what you guys think about all of this. If you've been patient enough and listened to the whole episode, what do you think? Did I miss anything? Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? But let's move on and just say. So, study number 9 has the exact same problem as the above study by Joshanloo M. And that's the most recent one that I could find in 2024. Do zodiac signs relate to well-being? Evidence from the General Social Survey is the journal. And it was only done on sun signs and how sun signs relate to well-being. And then again, it's not really, for one, it's not really the biggest health indicator that you look at in astrology. It speaks for your energy and vitality. But if we're going to talk about energy and vitality, we're not going to look at your zodiac sun sign. We're going to look at the aspects. We're going to see, is it debilitated by anything? Is it squaring anything? Is it sessi-squaring anything, Is it in detriment? Like, what is going on? Besides the fact that your sun sign, for instance, is in Pisces. That doesn't give us enough information as astrologers to let you know what you can do naturally and holistically to for your health. Like, astrologers are obviously not healthcare practitioners. Some are. I think a lot are, actually. There's well, not a lot, but there's a couple that do both. But so I have to be really careful when I say that. There is something called medical astrology, and I know doctors that are interested in astrology as well. So you can use it that way, but not the way that's done in the study. So in conclusion, I would like to say this. This study is just wasn't useful. Wasn't helpful. Didn't help anybody. You wasted your time, sir. There's better ways to, if you really, really want to, like if you're a scientist and you really want to disprove astrology, please find an astrologer and make sure that you're taking into account all of the language or all of the nuance before you try and isolate it. Because once you isolate it, all professional astrologers will be like, well, yeah, obviously that's not gonna, if you're gonna look at the sun sign, it's not gonna be a good predictor of your well-being and health. It's kind of obvious. But anyway, that's all I have to say for that. I just want to say, let me know if I missed a study. I would like to look at that, but I think we looked at a lot today to say, and I can say for myself personally, that I strongly believe astrology has never, not once in history, has been disproven by science. The arguments that a lot of scientists use, like popular scientists online, to disprove astrology can be argued against by other professional astrologers that know what they're talking about. So in conclusion to this episode, I would like to say that after this long research, I'm not even sure if it's possible to test astrology in a lab setting using empirical evidence, because it's not a science. It's a language. But you can try. I encourage you to, but do it properly. And maybe it is possible. It's just never been done. So with that said, my initial claim stands that astrology is not a science. It's not even an art. And even though it has artistic and creative properties, has scientific properties, astrology is a language. One that you need to learn to understand. Because once you do, there's no going back. You start seeing that the universe is speaking to you through this language. And what all these studies miss is an understanding of what astrology can be used for. And in my perspective, astrology helps you understand the cycles of life, how to pass the test that, like the test that life throws at you at certain points, how not to miss opportunities, and to finally come to peace with the fact that the life tests, like Saturnian, like the Saturn return or anything like that, is not to punish you, but to prepare you for the next blessing, next challenge, and next chapter in your life. And these tests are constant. And you don't need an astrologer to know that this is what life does, this is what happens. You don't need astrological knowledge. This is just a different kind of philosophy. Or not even a different kind of philosophy. It's just the laws of the universe that we're constantly being tested. We're constantly being encouraged to do better, to be better as people. So you're here to grow and evolve, and astrology is a map to help to guide you through this evolution. Please let me know once again if you disagree with any of these points. But if you want me to do one on the history of astrology, I'd be happy to. Or if we would like to move on, I'd be happy to as well and do something a little bit different. But for now, actually, let me just read something out from Dane Rujar as well before we close. So before we close off this podcast, I just wanted to read this out to you from Dane Rujar, who was an astrologer and a psychotherapist, I believe, Frenchman from last century. But it was so timely because I just felt like reading it today, and I haven't really read this book before, so I feel like synchronicity wise it's important. Let's just get into it. Astronomy and all precise sciences deal solely with objective time, clock time, regulated by universally accepted standard. The standard is fundamentally the sidereal day, the period between two successive returns of a star to the meridian, the time needed for a complete daily rotation of Earth around its axis. Astrology, insofar as it is based on astronomical data, deals also with the objective time and its cycles. But astrology is not merely a study of celestial cycles in themselves. It is a technique of interpretation of the meaning of these cycles with reference to the possibilities for growth in individuals. And also this one, its essential purpose, one true to its highest and truest form in human affairs, is to indicate the possibilities for individual development inherent in the significant turning points in the cycle of a human life. And you guys, please, you know how to contact me. Please do if you have any questions, concerns. You wanna have a lovely debate about something or an angry discussion, I'm right here. But for now, that is all she wrote.